I mean, the polling shows that blacks are very concerned about job competition, but still take fairly tolerant and open views on immigration policies. The leadership is caught in a really difficult position because if they start speaking about restriction, their option really is to support Republicans, which is not a very attractive position for a lot of black leaders who are Democrats. It's an unspoken issue in a lot of the American discourse at this point, and it's something that at some point it needs to be confronted. And over time, when you've got a very large part of the low-wage labor force is made up of recently arrived immigrants, and there is a constant flow, particularly of undocumented, you end up with structural changes in the nature of the low-wage labor force. And we've seen that now, that there are whole niches of occupations that have shifted to being oriented towards an immigrant labor force. These changes affect the native-born workers who compete for those kind of jobs. And in many places, those are African-American young men with less than a high school education who are facing a whole series of additional barriers towards economic opportunity. And no one has wanted to talk about this issue for a long time.
Many African Americans are concerned that Hispanics increasingly get minority set-aside contracts that were originally envisioned for blacks. That's a tangible issue. More intangible, and this is something we Latinos don't like to talk about, but I think we need to address in some way. Some African Americans believe that Latinos do not really understand the historical indignities that blacks have undergone in this nation, and also that we don't really appreciate the struggles for civil rights and social justice that they have undertaken on behalf of all minorities. And I think there are issues there that bear watching that will have to be addressed. And maybe one thing that might come out of all this might be that there will be more light shed on these things.
Roberto, you said that we have a virtual open border. Lou Dobbs calls it a broken border. What's your sense, either or both of you, of support for actually strengthening the border, building a wall, a trench, whatever? Is there actually popular support for that idea?
Well, I mean, there's, for border enforcement writ large, I think you can get support. It can be a very general concept. I mean, if you poll on should the government do more to control the borders, you get, a question that simple will get you 75, 80% yes. If you ask people, will a fence be effective in controlling illegal immigration, the number goes down to like 10%. There's this worry that the border's not defended somehow, and that this is so, there'll be a lot more money spent on border controls. The militarization of the border started 13 years ago. I mean, we've invested a great deal in the border as a country over all through the second half of the Carter administration and through the whole of this administration. And if the measure of success is reducing the unauthorized flows, it didn't work.
Roberto, how do you see this playing out politically long term? In other words, we understand the short-term version and where the president has put himself and the Republicans, but what do you think the long-term effect as you look at polling for both parties?
I think it depends a lot on how things play out this year. I mean, one of the questions is how does the Republican base react? I mean, they've been very, the white males, less than a college education, conservative, politically, religiously evangelical, all those things in the polls get you ever higher numbers in terms of restrictive views towards immigration. And you were talking about a key part of the base of the governing party in this country. There's a sense in that population now that having basically won governance, having controlling both houses of Congress and the White House and now the Supreme Court, they're not getting what they wanted. And the question is, does this issue feed that further? If there's a sense we had the Sensenbrenner bill and we lost it. I mean, here was our, this was the expression of our will and our representatives didn't do it. What does that do to the Republican base? I think is probably the key political question here. And the other is what it does to the Latino vote in the long term.
And there are other unknowables. I would just add, depends where the economy goes. And also, very importantly, heaven forbid there's another 9/11 style attack and it turns out that the people infiltrated the country across that border. Because I think then the issue goes way beyond Mexicans and Latinos, and it becomes a security issue for the United States, a legitimate security issue, and how do you deal with that? That is already one of the factors that I think has helped propel this to the forefront since 9/11.
Roberto, can you please address what it has done, what all this has done to the Latino community itself? We talk about if this is a civil rights movement for the Latino community. They say that maybe it's just a sporadic type of movement built around one issue. What has it done to the Latino community? What's its impact in terms of its political empowerment?
Yeah.
And also, if you can talk a little bit about the leadership, the Latino leadership, new leadership emerging, if you can address that a little bit, please.
It's a hard question. I mean, just in terms of the facts on the ground, what's happened since starting with the march in Chicago on the 10th of March, has been by far the biggest mobilization of Latinos ever. Probably one of the biggest, civic mobilizations we've seen at any point in recent history. I mean, it's hard to think of, any other situation where over the course of about 6 weeks you had demonstrations that reached the six figures in a dozen U.S. cities, and then another 80 or 90 demonstrations with significant tens of thousands, all around one cause, all in one short period of time. The hard part is what you asked. So what does that mean? Is there a well-defined cause? There was when it was simply opposition to the House bill. And criminalization's now off the table. I mean, what's on the table is a much more difficult question. And the leadership's very divided over tactics, over strategy, over goals. This is not a top-down thing anyway. And so it's very hard to read because it's something that was very atomized, very fragmented in the way it started. These things tend to, can be galvanizing moments. I mean, anybody who participated in one of those marches will have part of their political identity formed. And there are a lot of young people who will be voters who participated in these things, and it may be the first time they engaged in any kind of political activity, and it could be formative in that way.
It partly depends. We'll see. We won't know for quite a while how many of their children and how many U.S.-born Latinos vote and get organized and participate in the system. We'll see.
We were speaking earlier about the panic, fears of raids in the immigrant community. Where do you think that fear comes from? What sparked it now? If anything, this legislation that's being discussed would offer many of them a road to citizenship. So why so much fear?
I think there might have been, it might come from real news of some raids on workplaces and so forth. I think, as Roberto mentioned, in some cities we have seen some evidence that people are being picked up, deported, and their families don't know anything about them until they're back in, Guadalajara, and they call and say, I'm back here. And somehow, esa bola está corriendo, that's running, and people are quite fearful of that. From what I see in the Senate compromise version, if people do leave the country, are not allowed back in, are picked up, deported in greater numbers than now, one thing we're going to see that I don't know that they've thought through so much is many cases of families being divided, because so many undocumented workers here have children born here. Many increasingly are women by themselves with their children. And if that happens, you're going to be hearing about and seeing a lot of stories that'll make Elian look like nothing in terms of the complexity.
You're talking about, rumors spreading among hundreds, maybe thousands of people at a time in these communities. I was in Charlotte on Monday, and they were reporting that schools where hundreds of kids didn't show up for school on Monday, and nobody you know, it was through the day, people were trying to figure it out, and they found out that there was a rumor that some people had been picked up at a Walmart on Friday afternoon. And by the end of the day, nobody could figure out, had anything really happened or not? I mean, it's a very peculiar circumstance. And just in closing, I mean, if it illustrates anything, it illustrates the extent to which in the society we've nurtured a very large category of people who live outside of our civic space. It's something, in reflecting on the meaning of all this policy, I think it's something that is important to consider as a way of understanding what we as a nation have done. The unauthorized, undocumented, illegal population, whatever you want to call it, now is larger than the number of people who lived under Jim Crow in 1954. It's a very large number of people who are completely outside the bounds of our civic spaces and have no recourse to any of our civic institutions. And the result of that is, now this multiplicity of incidents where you find people have no way of responding, no way of knowing what's the truth or what they should do about it.
I was on one thought, on that cultural anxiety that many proponents of the really tough immigration restrictions have, that Latinos somehow will not be assimilated in this society, will try to remake it on our own terms. I just wish they could come and see Poder.